Good morning to each and every one of you. But you will forgive me if I single out our three guests. I think that it is perhaps this that Owen Arthur and Dame Billy Miller had in mind when they agreed, when I was a young minister, to build this building, recognizing that a day would come when we might have to host not one, not two, but three of the very highest level appointed persons in the international public service, otherwise known as the United Nations. And it would therefore be remiss of me not to start off this morning by welcoming, first and foremost, it is true that they're all here for another meeting I have tomorrow as well, which I co-chair for the One Health Global Initiative. But I would like first to welcome the Director General of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. It is our distinct pleasure, truly, to have you here, and I look forward to meeting with you later. And then, of course, our dear friend Inga Anderson, who is the head of the United Nations Environmental Program, living in that other country that I also have cause to call home as well, in Kenya. And then, of course, our dear friend who is the boss today and who will this afternoon be, not afternoon, shortly, be among us in welcoming all of you in what really is truly an honor for this country, thank you, for this country to launch, Ms. Masturi, the first regional early warning systems launch after the agreement that was reached in Sharm el-Sheikh in Cairo. The two performances here this morning by Sky and Akeem show why we come to work every day, to be able to make this world, this country, a better place. The immense talent that was shared with you from this country this morning reminds us why individuals are so special. I want to thank Prime Minister Philip Pierre, who leads for us in the region the efforts on sustainable development, because in his efforts to help make this region more sustainable, there will be more Skies and more Akeems who will continue not just to flourish for their own individual benefit or the benefit of this region, but as I have contended always, as a humanizing influence on the global population. That, perhaps, has been the Caribbean's greatest contribution in the post-independence environment, to be able to provide the thought leadership and the conscience that is often needed to remind us that people who see people want others to see people. People who hear people want others to hear people. And people who feel people want others to feel people. This Caribbean region, whether from the thought leadership of Sir Arthur Lewis and Derek Walcott in St. Lucia, or the very pragmatic and philosophical framework of an Errol Walton Barrow to remind us of being friends of all and satellites of none, or the scholarship of Eric Williams and the conscience of Michael Manley, this Caribbean region, through the likes of Usain Bolt, through the likes of Rihanna, continue to remind the world that it doesn't require large size or power to make a definable difference in the global condition. It is ironic that one of the things that we come, therefore, to say in this whole issue of the climate crisis is that it is regrettable that we are forced to face a double jeopardy, having been the ones whose blood, sweat, and tears financed the Industrial Revolution that is now the bane of planetary and human existence. The dignity that was robbed of us during that exercise is potentially going to be robbed again as a result of the climate crisis. And I want us to reflect on words from Maya Angelou, where she said, and I quote, "During bad circumstances, which is the human inheritance, you must decide not to be reduced. You have your humanity, and you must not allow anything to reduce that. We are obliged to know we are global citizens. Disasters remind us we are world citizens, whether we like it or not." Sky spoke to us this morning about unity, being united. I'd like to speak to you about being united in partnership, because it is only when we are united in partnership and we remove the divisions that have been foisted on us, whether by history or law or whatever, that we can come together to fight what is the greatest global challenge since human civilization has taken responsibility for itself. There may perhaps have been greater challenges for dinosaurs, but we know what happened to them. And we therefore have to ask ourselves, how do we give ourselves the best chance of survival? We do so first and foremost by working together. Working together across countries, working together across institutions, working together across communities, working together sectorally and across sectors, working together in settling the financing that remains absent, working together in settling the legislative framework and policy framework that is critical, working together at all levels. And the first thing, whether as an individual who suffers from addiction or as a country that is exposed to vulnerability, the first requirement is to know. Is to know. And if we do not know and accept, then we are at risk of anything that comes our way. And that, for me, is the essence of the early warnings framework that we are seeking to put across the world, as you heard from my dear sister Amina, as a matter of right and not as a perk or being in the right place at the right time to hear. This requires a complete change in how nations and institutions function. And that's why I keep using simple language about seeing, hearing, and feeling. Because once you see people and hear people and feel people, you plan for them. But if you don't see, hear, or feel them, you take them for granted. And therefore, fundamental to this is our basic humanity and values. Whether it is in Pakistan, from which you have just come, Inga, and 7 months later, the flood waters remain unabated in what can only be described as an apocalyptic crisis, not expected to be seen in our lives. Whether it is in other experiences, we have first and foremost to understand and value the appreciation of how our values locate us to act. That's why I call for global moral strategic leadership, because there must be a standard set from which all of the rest of us can manage and judge ourselves and our actions. And if that's set, Akim, the greed that you speak so wonderfully of in your spoken word can be addressed And we then begin to understand that the only way greed can trump lives is in the alphabet, because G comes before L. We have to change how we think and act in this world if these actions are going to make a difference to the lives of so many. We talk about 1 in 3 in the Caribbean, and we talk about 6 out of every 10 in Africa not being able, and we can add Latin America in there. And why? Because if we don't get the fundamentals of development right, we can't get the settlement and mitigation of the crisis correct. Those who are on the front line are those who live precariously on mountain tops and on the sides of hills and mountains, as we discussed, on the banks of rivers, not because they do not know the risk, but because they do not have a choice more often than not. And that countries that even may want to do better have been robbed of the opportunities to be able to channel and funnel development to them in a way that makes sense. That's why the Bridgetown Initiative is so important to us. It's not just about climate. It's fundamentally about equity and fairness, justice and solidarity. How do we work together to allow countries to be able to better provide for those who cannot provide for themselves? And the early warning systems is just a small part of it all. And we know the benefit of it. We don't need anybody to tell us. We don't need to ask. If my hands are in the pockets, it's not because I am anything other than very cool. It's not meant to be disrespectful. But we don't need anybody to tell us. The truth is that we knew on the 31st of December, as I was driving in my car, 2019, feeling utterly optimistic about this country's development in 2020. We had just completed the second part of our debt restructuring. The first part completed in December 2018 for the domestic debt restructuring, the second part for the external debt restructuring. It was All Year's Day. I've learned now to hate All Year's Days. And those who are visiting will understand it, because the next All Year's Day I had to shut down the country for the pandemic. But I tell you these stories because you have to appreciate that life is not seen from speeches on a platform, but life is experienced on a daily basis. And what is the story that I tell you? That in this country, having listened to that BBC report, it stuck with me. And before the end of January, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all of the different departments started to put systems in place. By the beginning of February, we went, the Attorney General and myself, to Harrison's Point in St. Lucie, and I thank the European Investment Bank for coming in after and ratifying the expenditure that we made there to convert an old naval base into a hospital to prepare for COVID. I tell this story because anyone who knows my country, who knows Barbados, will tell you that with a single acute primary to tertiary hospital in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that if we had ever left that institution to be the place where we managed COVID from for 3 years and continuing, that God knows what would have happened to this country, particularly given the density of housing in the coastal areas where the majority of people live in this country. The ability to plan, the ability to prepare, the ability to put in play 4 times the amount of ICU beds that the country had and had had for 50 years made all of the difference to us. Fast forward then to to 2021 June. I'm up 12:30 at night preparing for cabinet the next morning. And I hear bowels roaring. And I assume that somebody on the highway is playing the fool, even though it was late at night. It turned out to be the beginnings of a 90-minute freak storm that would have, 46,000 lightning strikes, Sabu, in 90 minutes? Almost like a natural strobe light in a discotheque, because it never stopped. But you knew it wasn't constant because the eye still caught the flash. And the rain was horizontal, and by the next morning, there were at least 25, 27 houses, I can't remember, that were completely flattened. I remember visiting an elderly man who, to this day, God bless him, he stood in his kitchen, and then he moved when he realized that that structure would go completely. And he went under the cellar of the house until he could find that opportunity just to cross the road and go into his neighbor's garage. Front page of the Nation newspaper has a picture of him. But I knew what he felt, because I happened to be in Jamaica. My first trip to Jamaica was the weekend of Hurricane Gilbert. It is true that I have to ask myself how I fall in love with Jamaica so, because on that first afternoon I was pickpocketed. And by the Sunday, Gilbert hit. And by the Monday, I had gastro. And before the gastro, I stood up on Hope Road for 2.5 hours, because nobody in Jamaica believed that a hurricane was coming, because they had not had a serious hurricane since the 1960s. I was at a 50th birthday party, and everyone said, nah, man, no hurricane not hit Jamaica. Jamaica safe, sir. I was to go to the Blue Mountains that day. Still have not reached. I say this because even when you provide the warnings, if you do not have partnerships, if you don't have the reinforcing community education, if you don't have the plans that cause people to know that you are serious, the warnings will fall on deaf ears. We speak this morning in Barbados, but we extend deepest sympathy on our behalf, all of us, to the people of Turkey and Syria. And the numbers keep rising, and just before I came to get up to give the speech, the last number is 2,300 and rising. And why? Because even with the best early warning systems, there are some hazards that are difficult to manage. And when those things happen, when the human body is at rest, in other words, sleeping, the scale of destruction will always be greater. Potentially, same thing with that freak storm that I described. I have shown you what happens as with the pandemic, but I can go further. The Inter-American Development Bank, and I thank them, was instrumental in helping this country develop the National Coastal Risk Information and Planning Platform, what we call the NCRIP. I had to look down because you get so accustomed to acronyms that you forget what it is. But that is not a static instrument. And this is why the Bridgetown Initiative is so important. Because at almost all levels, the inability to parse development, as institutions sometimes, and particularly financial institutions would have us do, puts us deeper at risk. Because if you can't parse development for them and fit into neat boxes, you can't benefit. And even when you benefit, there's a belief that development can be done with 7-year and 10-year money. Well, the British government discovered in World War I, after World War I, that that was impossible. And having raised two bonds in 1914 and 1917, found themselves renegotiating those bonds in 1932 into effectively a 100-year bond, because you could not pay for the cost of war while paying for the cost of rebuilding from the war at the same time. It is no different in these small island developing states or developing countries globally. And we believe that our efforts for preparation and mitigation started only since Paris Agreement. Except that I'm here to tell you, and we can carry you, to show that from the middle of the 1980s, with the establishment of the Coastal Zone Management Unit, our country has been borrowing money, hundreds of millions of dollars from the IDB, to protect our coastal infrastructure, not only because we have a coastal economy, but because our major aquifers, particularly for the north of the country, are all coastal. And if the water in there becomes affected by high levels of salinity, you can kiss it all goodbye. And you then transfer yourself to a desal platform that is multiple times more expensive for the country in terms of competitiveness, but above all, for the families in the households who need water. I say these things because it is only through partnership at the community level and the family, with our emergency management services, preparing people for the possibility of the risk, for the reality of the risk, and the possibility of it becoming real. Our emergency management services must perfect the art of knowing who they are looking for and what they need, both before, sometimes during, regrettably, to save lives, and definitely after. Just after, or not just after, just before Cricket World Cup, when I had the responsibility of chairing for security for 10 countries, we put in place, and we used the opportunity to put in place a treaty that the people of Dominica benefited from after Hurricane Maria. A treaty that went beyond the regional security system, that said that countries in the Caribbean region will come to each other's aid in the event of natural disaster and civil unrest, so that the Jamaica Defense Force, the Trinidad Defense Force, the Guyanese Defense Force, and others could be mobilized at a minute's notice in order to support each other. And where the absence of the early warning signals cannot reach people, because we have another problem that we're not confronting. Before, most countries in the world benefited from broadcasting. But today we have narrowcasting and fake news. And the partnerships that are needed today at the global level and at the regional and national levels are therefore different. We need a validation or a verification system, both from our telecoms providers and the social media providers, that this warning is not fake news, and that this warning is real. And the belief that everybody listens to a national broadcaster anymore has been exploded long time, because people listen and function in the spaces where they get information, real or fake, but they believe it, and their comfort levels are there. So if you live in the hills somewhere, all you're doing is listening to YouTube and Dennis Brown and some good old school reggae, how are you going to hear? So what are the signals that take into account the modification of behavior and the modification of information that we have? At the same time, we also need partnerships within the region. And this notion about who is English, who is French, or who is Spanish, and who is Dutch speaking needs to be exploded, because the disasters and the hurricanes and them don't speak no language. They speak one language: destruction. And the quicker we come to realize that and cooperate the better. I suspect that at the level of the military, there's far more cooperation than at the level of civil society. And we need to bridge the gap for civil society in order to be able to do so. SEDIMA is doing its best and doing a wonderful job, Liz, in doing what you're doing. And I want to thank the World Food Program as well for choosing Barbados to preposition food to ensure that we have that capacity to respond. But the region needs to go even further. We need a recovery ship. I don't know what's the fancy language for it. But islands don't have the benefit of road networks to deliver quickly. And in some instances, runways will be destroyed in disasters. And there are ships that flow and go around the world. Some are hospital ships, but we need more than a hospital ship because we need a ship to provide fresh water. Immediately after a disaster, I can tell you firsthand from being in Jamaica, in Gilbert. Mercifully, I've never had more than a Category 1 hurricane in Barbados. But I've known what it is to experience hurricanes in Jamaica, Miami, and London, and New York. True, true, true. 1976 New York, 1988 London, Gilbert later, and Miami multiple times in the 2000s. We need to coordinate as CARICOM to work with the international community to ensure that there are two ships prepositioned, the north and the south. And why two? Because hurricanes do move quickly and quicker than ships. And therefore, Commodore, I'm sure that you would want the capacity to be able, because you will not always be able to land a plane where you need to go. And the ability to have access to clean water urgently in those first few weeks is critical if we are to avoid cholera. We also need to recognize that arbitrary numbers for debt sustainability in the context of small island developing states does not work. I told you that we have been doing coastal preparation since the 80s. Part of our debt is, in fact, to prevent the worst to our coastal environment. For every dollar of prevention, you save $7 in recovery expenditure. We know that. But when you are then told that your debt to GDP does not admit of you spending enough money to renew a school infrastructure that is more than 150, 200 years, 250 years in some instances, how then do you provide the support systems for people to be relocated, both pre and in many instances post-disaster? We do not have the capacity genuinely to withstand serious hurricanes in this region that are Category 3 and upwards. And if the international community does not understand that, then they do not understand our circumstances. And if the international community does not understand that both with the absence of a pact upon becoming independent, where after centuries of extraction of wealth, we were left just to face, as best we can, the needs of housing and education and health, with a treasury that had been emptied for centuries, then only to be foisted with international rules that are one size fits all, like that from the WTO that does not recognize special and differential treatment, but yet having now to allocate additional funding for environmental matters that were not even in circumstances where the allocation of funding for basic traditional human rights and development was already challenged, makes this journey even more complex. And when we understand that the cause of it is not our behavior or our values or our attitudes, then we have a crisis. Problem is that the crisis isn't unique to us. We are just the canaries. And whatever we thought before 2022 put paid, I suspect, to many people's doubts. Third World in 1970s told us that the definition of real heat was 96 degrees in the shade. London and Europe told us differently last year when 108 and 110 degrees became the standard. In the winter, the notion that a state in the United States of America could be 30 degrees from the temperatures on Mars is a sci-fi movie or book. Not the reality of what we saw in December, someone would argue, but unfortunately it was. Because when we start to get at minus 59 degrees, we know we are in dangerous territory. I want to thank the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his continued courage and compassion, his values, and his global moral strategic leadership. But I ask all of us, at whatever stance we find ourselves, at whatever position, to recognize that it is in doing these practical things, which yes, do require funding, and yes, it does require $3 billion, and yes, the United Nations has not completed the fundraising for it, for those who hear my voice. And if we could do better, we would for you. That is the truth. Because even when we received 100,000 vaccines in the heart of it, we distributed out of that over 25,000 to our brothers and sisters in the region, because we are nothing if we want to walk this journey alone. But we have now to do these small concrete things that will make a difference to the lives of many. And we will continue to fight for the adaptation funding, and we will continue to fight for the concessional funding, and we will continue to fight for the fiscal space, because even if you give me all of the funding, and I have no fiscal space because of arbitrary metrics for debt sustainability, because every dollar of debt is not the same. Even if we do all of these things, there are still going to be some people who we have not reached. And that is why then the human partnership at the level of the community becomes so critical. And that doesn't require a leader, a prime minister, or anybody. It requires the average citizen in our region and across the world to spread the message and to let people know that, like with everything else we know, prevention is always better than cure. And that secondly, awareness, whether as an addict, as a vulnerable person, or as a powerful person, the first step is to know and to remain engaged. I hope that the launching of this early warning system in our country, Barbados, as a first regional launch globally, in the presence of 3 distinguished United Nations leaders, as fate would have it, plus all of the diplomatic corps and all of the local persons, that we also in this room send the message that partnership is real, but it is not yet at the levels that we need it. And if we can continue to build those partnerships from the community and the family right back up to the international level, then the spectacle of us failing can be left for the books and not become our reality. But never let us be so arrogant as to believe that it cannot happen. The earthquake last night was an awful reminder that there were people who were having lunch yesterday with their families and who made plans to do things this morning that they are no longer in a position to do because the family has been destroyed and the businesses affected have been destroyed. And the shadow of that destruction will be far longer than the news story that reports it this morning. I hope and pray that those who hear our voices understand that these are not now speeches for the sake of speeches, but that this is speeches to propel action and partnership. And I thank you once again, therefore, for choosing this country to help send that message, because we know, as I said, that it is real, and we must never be arrogant enough to believe that it cannot happen to us. For this world knows that there are extinct species. I referred to the dinosaurs just now. And this world knows that there are failed states and failed civilizations. Let us work in partnership to ensure that there is no further record of failed species or failed civilizations, or worse, at the individual level, loss of life. Thank you.